All right. Here we go. So I'm going to take you guys through a few slides. I think you've probably seen these, but I'm going to go ahead and go through them anyway. If you haven't seen them, it's because you haven't watched my lectures, which you were supposed to watch. But anyway, just kind of want to touch on some things with you. This is a slide. This is a slide that shows the progression of Indian lands ceded or given up, taken away, really would be a more appropriate way of saying that. And inasmuch as we're reading about farmers here and the impact of industrialization on the farmers, don't forget that they are farming land that was forcibly taken from the Native Americans.
I would have cursed them all.
Pardon?
I would have cursed them.
Well, that's good, I think. But the point is here that for a couple of centuries now, by the time we get to the 1870s, you could argue for 3 centuries, but certainly in the last, say, 100 years or so of our country's history up until the 1890s, this taking of land from the Native Americans was regular, it was widespread, and of course it was disastrous. But we'll read more about that in the future, okay? But when we're talking about these farmers in Wyoming and Colorado and Kansas and Nebraska, even further to the east, Illinois, up in the upper Midwest, just remember that this land was cheap for them. Sometimes it was free for them. They could homestead the land, which means they got 160 acres for free as long as they kept it for 5 years and made some capital improvements on it, like building a house. And so the point here is that it's interesting, ironic, to note that at the same time that these farmers are seeing their freedoms, experiencing their freedoms taken away from them by the banks, you got to understand that they are having this problem in part because they took someone's freedom away from them, which is to say the Native Americans. So there's a lot of theft going on here, in other words, okay? And of course, theft is offensive. For some of us, theft is kind of the worst, you know. It's like I work hard for my stuff and then someone comes and steals my bike. It's like, God, you know, go work for your own stuff, you know. Well, the principle is the same here, all right? So I just kind of want you guys to see how much territory was taken away, when it was taken away, although we're not going to get into that all that much. This is a map of the South which shows the extent of sharecropping, okay? In brown are the regions where 0 to 20% of the land was sharecropped. Basically what that means is that where the brown spots are, that's where the plantation owners were able to keep their land and hold their land. And so, you know, this is where all the big plantations were, in other words. All right? 21 to 34% in yellow. And then the 35 to 80% in blue. You can also know that these regions, the blue ones, were the poorest regions. Even precisely because, by the way, that's where all the sharecropping took place. All right, we'll touch on that a little bit more. So that just gives you an idea of at least what farming looked like in the South. And please remember that in this reading, we are talking about farmers, and for the most part we're talking about farmers in the Midwest. But the author is trying to make it clear that what was true for farmers in the Midwest was true for farmers in the West, way out here, Nevada, California, you know, further west from the Midwest, and even in the South. All right? All right, I want you to get a sense of railroad development and how brisk, how quick, how intensive it was. Basically, this country went from no railroads in 1828 to more railroad in this country by 1900 than in all of the rest of the world combined, in terms of track, in terms of hundreds of thousands of miles of track, okay? And you can see that a lot of these railroads started out as very small affairs, if you will, like Maybe you decided you wanted to be a railroad owner. You were going to raise some capital, and maybe you started this railroad from here at Fort Worth to wherever this point is, and that's your railroad. That would have been characteristic of railroad business in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. And what you want to do, it's like starting a tech company or making an app. You want to make an app that somebody will buy from you. It's business. And what happens in railroads is what happens in industry generally during these decades that we're looking at, so that for us today, railroads can just represent all of industry, all of big business, industrialization generally, okay? So the point is that over time, railroads become consolidated, and the railroad companies get larger and larger, and fewer, and more powerful, right? And in part, it's because they have a good relationship with Wall Street. Wall Street's happy to find capital for them, financial capital. By financial, I mean capital that finances. I don't mean financial in terms of dollars. I mean financial capital. That is to say, money that has to be raised to build a business. And there were all kinds of ways that this happened. Wall Street rose the money. The states and the federal government rose the money. So remember, all this land, 10 miles on either side, 10 to 20 miles on either side of this railroad track right here, all of that land, or half of that land, would have been given to the railroad company, so that every other square mile belonged to the railroad company. This, is kind of an incentive to build railroads, because the nation, think about it, the nation needed to industrialize. And railroads are not necessarily how you move people from place to place, although that's important. Railroads are how you move product from place to place. It's about economics, in other words. It's about moving produce, right? And don't forget that those railroads are going to charge prices to transport. And of course, one of the things our farmers will run into is railroads becoming less and less competitive because they were becoming more and more consolidated. And once you remove your local competition, you can charge higher prices. This is the problem with monopoly, not the game Monopoly, but monopoly capitalism. This is the problem with monopoly capitalism, and that's why we try to minimize monopolies. We try to keep monopolies down so that they can't raise prices on us, okay? And so the farmers eventually ran into a problem because they could grow the crops, but they couldn't afford to pay to transport them to market. See? So just as this railroad development here is a web, I want you to see that all of these different factors we'll be talking about become this web of our national economy that, to use a metaphor, essentially catches farmers in its holding power. They can't get out. My leg's stuck in a web, Spider-Man, right? Can't get out. All right. Notice also, and this is really not all that important, but notice also that there are, shall we say, certain industries that these railroads serve, at least in the South. So you have textile and manufacturing here. Textile manufacturing in this region. Notice this region then connected to the rest of the regions by railroads. You have coal and iron mining down here in Alabama. We talked about that in the last couple of readings. The industrialization of the New South. We're talking about the New South in this sense. And tobacco growing regions up here, right? So the point here is that railroads are very important for the growth of the national economy. Which is why, by the way, national political parties like the Republicans and the Democrats will be interested in industrialization and the expansion of railroads. Okay? Let me say one more thing about railroads. If you think about the railroad itself, the rails, the steel, the technology, the engine. Notice that all of those things are the products of heavy industry. They're not just trains, in other words. They are actually produced by iron and steel forgeries and large-scale manufacturers who make trains, let's say, or train cars, or railroad track, right? And all of that stuff has to be, all of the resources that go into that development have to be extracted. It's big business, in other words. You need all kinds of chemicals, you need all kinds of ores or metals, you need coal. I mean, you just need a lot of stuff to make a railroad. And so the railroads then become a kind of nice way of just encapsulating for a general survey course the whole physical side of industrialization. Okay? Now, here's another schema, another map, I should say. This is how many railroads there were and where they were in the South in 1859. Now, I don't want to get off on this, but just think about it. Not much. I told you the other day, there's one of the reasons why the North won the Civil War is because they had more railroad production, more railroad track, frankly. How are you going to move troops? How are you going to move supplies through the South? And then, of course, as the war went on, the North simply destroyed the railroad tracks, so they couldn't be used, right? Well, look what happens between 1859 here and 1899. 40 years. Just 40 years. From there to there. We're talking about billions and probably trillions of dollars back then, and certainly bazillions of dollars worth of development in today's dollars. Okay? And what I want you to see then is that the railroads knit, K-N-I-T, knit the whole nation together. And on every one of those tracks, don't think about people moving from point A to point B. Think about products moving from point A to point B. In that sense, the railroads were centrally important in the functioning of our country. Now, having said all of that, they also needed capital. And so the banks then become involved, right? The banks will loan them money, charge them interest. They will make the interest payments, right? Just like with the farmers. The farmers would borrow money from the banks and try to pay back their loans. Okay? Standard procedure. Unless the farmers decide that the end of the world is coming because they can't hold on to their farms. And that's really the story that we're telling here. About a crisis in the countryside where people in the countryside can't survive as free market participants, as farmers. They can only eventually survive not as independent farmers, but eventually tenant farmers and then sharecroppers. And if things really get bad, what they'll do is they'll find themselves as wage laborers. Wage laborers. Not independent farmers, for which, by the way, they sacrificed their lives to move west, packed everything in a wagon, took their family and their kids and moved out west, to build the American dream, at least as it looked in 1860, 1870, 1880. And they go. By the 1880s and 1890s, they can't make it, and they are pissed. Okay? Notice that, these are the major railroad tracks. Notice the cattle trails from Texas that would take cattle up to this region right here, which is where all of the beef processing plants were made, and they would be slaughtered. Now, you may not think of cattle production as industrialization, but it is. Large-scale cattle growth, cattle production, large-scale meat production is big business. So the meat will be processed in this region here. It will be put on railroad cars and shipped to Chicago. It'll be put on ships and shipped to Europe. It'll be put on ships and shipped around to the East Coast. Beef, right? Very important part of the process. Look at the railroad land grants that I mentioned, so that this land right here, all that land, most of that land is owned by, for instance, the Southern Pacific. Now imagine California. You drive up Highway 99, and it seems like every 5 miles there's a town. And you say to yourself, oh, Delano's in Delano because it's on the highway. Kingsburg's on the highway, Selma's on the highway, Fresno's on the highway, Madera's on the highway. That's why they built those towns there. No. The towns are where they are because the railroad tracks are where they are. And the land that's adjacent to the railroad tracks was always the most valuable land. Just a second. So that if you're a farmer or a merchant, you want to be close to the railroad track because every mile you have to transport your stuff or go to market to get your stuff to sell, that's a cost. Now notice, the railroad companies get this land. The very existence of a railroad raises the value of that land, and then they get to do what with that land? If they want to, they can sell it. Now I want you to see something. That is government help. That is industrial affirmative action. That is giving an advantage to the businesses for the purposes of economic development. It's favoring, in other words, the railroads over other industries because you need the railroads. All right, Carlos? Huh? Never mind. Okay. Huh? Okay, Brian says let's move on, so I guess we're going to move on. All right. So what happens to a farmer when he loses his farm? He becomes a tenant or a sharecropper. This is how his life goes. Here's the tenant farmer. He plants crops. He harvests them in the autumn. He turns over up to 1/2 of his crop to the landowner as payment for rent. That's sharecropping. I grow it on your land. I give you half the crop. You get to take that to market. I get to take mine to market. And then what happens is I end up spending my half of the crop to pay off my debt. My debt, which has come from the merchant, the so-called finishing merchant. So, finishing merchants loan tools and seed at up to 60% interest to the tenant farmer so he can plant his spring crop. The farmer also secures food, clothing, and other necessities on credit from merchant until harvest, and the merchant holds a lien or a mortgage on part of the tenant's future crops and payment of debt. Now, if you're the landowner in this, you rent your land to a tenant in exchange for 1/4 to 1/2 of the tenant's future crop. So notice, landowner does well, merchant does very well, tenant farmer can't hardly keep his head above economic water. If I could tell you guys anything and give you one piece of advice, it would be this. Fight, don't spit. Fight to stay out of debt. And student loans are the most tempting. I know a lot of you have them because you have to have them. I'm not saying they're wrong. They keep you in school, okay, fine. Do not mortgage yourself up to your gills ever. especially with student loans, because those things never go away. The only thing that you can wipe out a student loan debt, not bankruptcy even, is your death. You die, you don't have to pay back your student loan, but in every other set of circumstances, you have to pay it back. And I'll give you an illustration. You know my daughter is a quadriplegic. She had a brain injury 4 years ago. She's 42. She can't do anything for herself. We take care of her at our home. We got a thing in the mail the other day from the Student Loan Corporation saying, we finally found you, Melissa Carlton, we're her conservators, we finally found you, you owe us $425 on a student loan. Well, my wife, who's the conservator, sent him a letter and said, hey, she can't pay this back. She's indigent. She's quadriplegic. And they're going to write off the loan, right? But I want you to see that they hunted her down and demanded the $425. Right? I could go on and on about debt, but you don't want to get into it. Do not do it. You will hurt yourself. Okay? Stay out of debt. Avoid those credit card people over in the free speech area. All right? All right. Another thing I want you to see is that when we're talking about what's going on in the West and industrialization and Western development as part of industrialization, you may think to yourself, wait a minute, these were farmers. How can you call that industry? Well, the answer is, it's industry and industrialization because they're producing food for the market, which goes throughout the country and throughout the world, for that matter. It's part of the industrial economy. At the same time, of course, you also have these places out here in the West where they mine not only gold and silver, but other precious metals. So think about it. Mining is industrialization. Although the mines are tucked away in some mountain at 8,000 feet in eastern Nevada or something like that, right? Out in the middle of nowhere. But that's part of industrialization too. You follow me? It's all necessary for industrialization, is the point. Okay? This is an interesting map. It shows where immigrants moved, right? So, in these regions right here that look like this, more than 20% were foreign born in 1881. Now, you might expect that down here because it's close to Mexico, but look up here in Wyoming. In that region right there, in 1881, more than 20% were foreign born in these areas in green now. So now you jump ahead what? You jump ahead 40 years in the same region, and now you have, let me see, more than 20% foreign born in 1920. I'm missing something here. Help me out. More than 20% foreign born in 1881. More than 20% foreign born in 1920. What's the difference? That doesn't make sense. What am I missing? What's that?
They're outlined in the green. It's just smaller.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm not seeing it. Sorry about that. But the point I want to make is you probably don't think of North Dakota or Montana, let's say. You probably don't think of that as a land of immigrants. But it was a land of immigrants. My grandmother's father immigrated from Sweden, 1880s, went somewhere in the upper Midwest, and then, of course, he moved eventually to Kingsburg, California, which was a Swedish colony, right? Anybody from Kingsburg? Any Kingsburgians here? All right. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of share that stuff with you. I'll obviously have more to say as we go along, but I kind of wanted you to see those, those visuals, okay? All right, so Brian, you wanted to do number 4?
I want to know more about it.
You're not prepared for number 4. Okay. All right. I was going to say, well, why don't you tell us about number 4 then? All right. Instead, we'll start over here. And Brian, get us started on the picture of life during the farmer during this period. What were the obstacles to success? In other words, what were the difficulties the system put in their way? By the way, let me ask you this, Brian. I put the system in quotation marks. What do you think I'm trying to get at here?
that there's a system it's pretty much corrupting the entire world. That starts a chain of making money, and it's like an endless way to make poor people poor and the rich richer, I guess.
Okay, so the system then is the dynamics of the economy,
Pretty much.
and it works in such a way as to enrich some and to impoverish others?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah. Deandra, but still on that question. Some would say, Farrell, you're just trying to make it look like people with money and big business are bad. So the question, I guess, is, when we look into this, I mean, why should we look into it? The system, in other words. So, and another thing is, generally speaking, let me just show of hands. Not your opinion, but what you think out there in the world people think. A show of hands. How many of you think that most people in this country think that the reason people are poor is, well, their own fault? Their own fault. It's their fault. You think most people think that it's your fault if you're poor? Okay? How many of you think that most people think it's not your fault if you're poor? Well, not everybody raised their hand, so what's the other option? How many of you think how many of you think most people think it's a combination of your own effort and, well, the system? Okay. Now, I would agree with that. I would agree with that. However, one of the reasons I teach class the way I do, one of the reasons I choose the topics the way I do, is because I want all of my students to wrestle with the degree to which success comes to people with advantage because they're given advantages, and lack of success comes to people all too frequently because they can't get a hold of the advantages. So that the system, whatever it is that we're talking about, the system in this case is the financial system. And whether or not it actually promotes opportunity. How many of you watched 45's speech the other night? Not surprised? What he is selling the nation, is that our tax cut package, our of the tax system, is going to spread opportunity. It will be interesting to watch what happens over the next 5 to 10 years, and to find out whether or not the tax reform actually spreads or makes more accessible opportunities for people. He's convinced, the Republicans are convinced, that this is how you do it. But what I want you to see is this. In the broadest terms, they changed the rules. They changed the rules of how much people are taxed. They changed the rules, and they're selling it as a middle-class tax cut, but all of the scoring of it seems to say that in the long run, it's going to benefit the rich much more than it is the middle class. Okay? Now, let me just say one more thing. I might say two more things. What I also want you guys to think about are the rules. And who makes the rules. And how the rules, get this, the rules shape the market. You can walk across campus right now, walk through the free speech area, and say, hey, free marketeers, I want to talk to somebody about the free market. The free market's good. I guarantee you, well, I can't guarantee you, but you'd probably find somebody who would say, oh yeah, I believe what we need is we need a free market. We need to free the markets up. What I want you to see is that there's no such thing as a free market. The market is always shaped by the people who have the power. They shape it, they determine what the taxes are, they determine who gets advantages, what kinds of advantages they get, right? And that's what was happening at the end of this century, okay? All right, so Brian, I asked you to get us started. Number one, what obstacles did these people face? Very briefly, very quickly, very efficiently. Because I've used up all the time.
I don't know. Sorry.
You don't know what the obstacles are. You can't come up with one obstacle.
Mortgages.
Mortgages. Okay, Brian, tell us about the obstacles that mortgages provided. How were mortgages obstacles?
They would put people in debt and then help them out with money. So they would give them money, and then by giving them money, they would pretty much make them pay back even more within the years. So,
Well, if you borrow money, you got to pay it back, but you got to pay it back at interest because the banks need to make money, right?
right, which
Okay.
would be like an endless life thing, right?
Okay. So mortgages were an albatross around people's necks.
Pretty much.
Pretty much. Made them poor. Savannah, what other problems did these people face?
The capital took over their mortgage.
Okay, capital took over their mortgage. What do you mean?
It was with the,
You mean banks controlled their lives?
the liquid capital that was in there,
Uh-huh.
controlled them and how they paid for their things.
Okay. So that the banks ended up having so much power over them, and the banks wouldn't, cut them any slack. Eventually, they ended up feeling like they were enslaved to the banks, right?
Yeah.
Who was doing all the work on these farms? The banks?
No.
The farmers, right? Okay. So we have mortgages. That's a problem. We have banks, and as an actor, we have banks, and that's a problem. Is it Elizabeth? What else?
Lands and supplies.
Okay, tell me about land and supplies. What do you mean?
Like,
That is a problem. They had to pay for stuff, right?
yes.
So they needed seed, but they also needed shovels, and they needed clothes, and they needed, food, right? Okay. But those kinds of things were expensive, right? Okay. And they may have been expensive because of tariffs, because of taxes on imports that were being put on imports into this country, which tariffs always allow domestic production to raise prices. Okay? So here's another government policy, tariffs, that raise the prices of supplies, as you said, that the farmers need. Another economic problem, right? Okay, Deandra, can you think of anything else?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Alex, can you think of anything else that we've missed? Problems that these people, obstacles to their success.
Some obstacles were things like the weather, bugs, plant diseases, drought. These things would affect the crops, and farmers wouldn't be able to sell as much crops.
Okay, that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. So-called natural disaster, right? Not man-made natural disaster, but natural disaster, right? You can plant a whole crop, and you might lose it in a day if the locusts come through, right? And in that sense, Fraser calls, I don't know if I wrote it down up here, Fraser calls farmers speculators. So not only is there speculation in land value driven by Wall Street and mortgages, but the farmers themselves are gamblers. Right? Anybody know any farmers? Yeah, and it is a gamble. I mean, you put a lot on the line. But your farmer friends, let's say they're in oranges and they've got 10 acres of oranges. If they get hit by a freeze and they lose their whole crop, what happens? Do they lose everything? No, why?
The trees still last more years.
Pardon?
Trees go throughout the years.
Well, yeah, but that's not why. I mean, huh? Pardon? Yeah, right, crop insurance. Think about that for a second. Just having crop insurance means that if your crop gets wiped out, your crop's insured. Was there any such thing back in the 1880s or 1890s? No. These people lived on the edge, right? Okay. So, natural disaster. Is it RECell?
Yes.
Yeah, what else? Anything else?
Not sure.
You're not sure? Okay. Martel, anything else?
I'm not sure.
Okay. You, sir? Sue?
Same. Not sure.
No. All right. Heaven, anything else we're missing here? Turn around. Turn around here, baby. That's pretty much it?
Yeah.
Okay, I just got her on camera long enough to say, that's about it.
That's about it.
That's about it. Okay, that's about it. All right. Is there anything we're missing?
Railroads.
Okay, railroads. Okay, I talked about that, but railroads, right? So the fact that the railroads can raise their prices and so forth. These are all problems, right? That these farmers had to work against. They're all obstacles, okay? Right? What would you say, Brian?
The railroads still had to pay the banks because they would get money from them, right? And then the banks would hold their money. And then, no.
Well, but let me just ask, if you're a railroad and you're into Wall Street for $12 million, and she's a farmer and she's into Wall Street for $10,000, Wall Street going to come down on her more than you? Or you more than her? No. No. They're going to help the railroads out because they have so much more to gain. Right? Okay? All right. All right. Whereas this chapter is about what's happening in the countryside, how does it tie the countryside and farmer or farm labor to the industrialized city and the factory worker? How might they both be seen as victims of the system? Okay, so now we want to ask about the degree to which these people in the countryside are, shall we say, not the countryside, or not just the countryside, Carlos. So question number 2.
My laptop froze, so
Well, you have a brain, don't you?
yeah.
Well, what difference does it make? Come on, you read it. How does it tie the countryside and the farmer or farm labor to the industrialized city and the factory worker? I talked earlier about the web, right? Mm-hmm. The web of the rail. Tell us how, when we talk about people living in the countryside, they're not isolated. They are isolated, but they're connected to the rest of the country and to New York. How's that work?
I don't know.
Isla?
I don't know.
Oh, you said you don't know?
The railroads. I just said the railroads.
Okay. Maria, help us out.
My name's not Maria.
What's that?
My name's not Maria.
Oh, it's not Maria, sorry. Can you still help us out even though I botched your name?
I don't know.
You don't know, all right. Does anybody know? The question's written on the damn board, Brian. What the hell? Una?
They were victims of the system because they needed jobs, so they worked in the industry, but the industry had poor working condition and low wages, and they had children working, so then people formed activist groups, and they protested for child labor and the wages and the harsh working conditions, so that's how they were victims of the system.
And here you're talking about so-called industrial workers, right?
Yes.
Right. But in similar ways, farmers, though they didn't work in the same kinds of circumstances, they're also victimized by the entire industrial system, right? They're victimized by the mortgages and by the banks, right? And they end up losing their farms. They become tenants and then sharecroppers. And then after they can't sharecrop anymore, they might find themselves working in a mine, or for that matter, working for some other farmer as just a wage laborer, right? But notice that there's no protection for these people. As individuals, they are weak. And so you said, basically, movements start to pop up. Unions start to pop up for people working in industrial factories. But in this context, we have the populist political movement popping up, right? A movement that calls for certain kinds of solutions, right? To fix the problem in the countryside, okay? So to jump ahead for a moment to number 4, in what ways was populism, that is to say the reaction to all of the stuff that we're talking about, the reaction in the countryside, in what ways is this populism, according to Fraser, in what ways is it a war of the worlds? Rosa? Tell me I got your name right, because I'm embarrassed still. What's your name, by the way? Rosa. It's Rosa.
I don't know. I think.
What's my name? Huh? Okay, well, there's a lot of students that can't do that, so I'm sorry. I'm working on it, okay? I'm an old man with gray hair and cobwebs in my brain. Anyway, go ahead, Rosa. In what way is all of this a war of the worlds? Or, stated differently, a culture war?
I don't know. I think it was because it made a lot of people argue, or it was complicated in a way.
Oh, certainly complicated, absolutely. It was warlike, right? But how, let's assume that there are two worlds here. There's the rural world and there's the city world. How would we characterize the world in the countryside versus the world in the city?
In the city, they had I think it was New York, they said, where it was all the big corporations, and then in the city it was like... And
the banks, right?
Yeah, it was more like poor people and farmers and laborers. They would be affected more than the people in the city.
Okay. Yeah. But when the people in the rural countryside conceptualize this struggle as a war of the worlds, and they say it's us against them, it's us farmers, which, by the way, we've characterized pretty well in this class today. This is our culture. It's the way we see the world. We are pitted against these very powerful forces in the city. What I'm trying to get at, Christian, is how would we characterize at least the way that these people in the rural countryside characterized those people in the city? And I'm not talking about the poor industrial workers. These rural workers would have been on the side of the poor industrial workers. In fact, they would have said, we're just like them. But when it comes to the bankers and the people who own the railroads, how would they characterize those people?
As poor?
No. As the devil. What else?
They're like they had like that luxury life, and they just how the poor people, they just looked at them like, oh, you know, like they're just so stubborn.
Okay.
Self-stubborn and self-individual.
Okay, but luxury, right? Their life is luxurious, and ours is not, right? They are the forces of the devil, and we are the salt of the earth. We are the people. They are capitalism. They are the banks. They are, shall we say, people who morally are completely and absolutely corrupted. So, Brian, that's how we go to culture war here. It's a culture war because we're talking about two completely different worlds, right? So that the poor, then, or I should say the people in the countryside, see themselves as poor. And when we think of the poor, especially the poor who receive government aid, how do a lot of people in this country characterize those poor people?
Money pits.
Money pits. Parasites. You know what a parasite is? Parasite needs a host. Parasite lives off of an organism. That's a parasite. Let me ask you the question, Rosa. Not Mass, this Rosa. Rosa, if you ask these rural farmers, were they the parasites or were the bankers the parasites? Stop. Full stop. We got a minute. Listen to this. There is a mentality in this country that property owners and business owners are the people who build this country. And therefore they should have a right to more of their money, to more power politically, and they would look at people who are poor as parasites, sucking off of the teat of the government and the rich. I want you to think about whether or not it's possible that they are the parasites. That the real creative and productive force in this country is and always has been the people who work. Now they of course would say, well, the unemployed, the poor, they're getting government aid, they're not working. My question is, why aren't they working? Maybe they're not working because corporations are sitting on huge stacks of cash and not investing that money. Maybe they're sending the money offshore. Maybe they're charging exorbitant rates for interest. Or maybe, for instance, they are creating a real estate problem like in this country in 2007 and 2008 when the market got so hot, prices got so high, the market crashed, and 11 million people in this country ended up upside down on their mortgages and, think about it, were essentially required to pay those mortgages off. Now let me tell you a real life story. I'm not Mr. Tragedy, okay, but I got a couple to share, and I'm going to share this and then we'll be done. In 2006, my wife had finished her nurse practitioner education up at UC Davis. I had my PhD. We kind of got catapulted into this economic place where we could finally get our dream house. So we sold our little 1,500 square foot home, 3 bedrooms that we couldn't fit in anymore with our kids, and we bought a house over near Fresno High, 3,000 square feet, 2 stories, beautiful, just beautiful, and we thought we could make the strokes on the $660,000 mortgage we took out. Right? Now think about it for a second. We bought that house in 2006. By 2008, the market had crashed, and we're living in a house and making strokes on a house that we mortgaged $625,000 for, and it was worth half of that. So we were struck. Do we keep paying the payments? For a couple years, we kept paying the payments. We had signed the papers anyway. We're responsible. That's what Americans do. They make their payments, right? You got to be moral. You borrowed money from the banks. You got to be moral. You got to pay it back. That's the way it goes. Tough luck. Then I started looking into who created the crisis, and it turns out it was the banks. And in particular, it was the bank that we bought our house from. And after 2 or 3 years, guess what? I said, screw them. I'm going to stop making my payments. So we stopped making our payments, and then, we decided to try to make our payments. But finally, in late 2012, we just said, forget it. We're not making the payments anymore. And, frankly, they didn't hunt us down. They didn't kick us out. We stayed in the house for 3.5 years without making a payment, right? Finally, in May of 2016, we sold the house. It's called a short sale. You sell it short, meaning that you sell it for less than it's worth. We bought that house for $660,000. In May of 2016, it sold for $300,000. What's the point? The point is, the banks, big business, can screw around in ways that the rest of us can't, you see? And they have a lot of power over us, and in that sense, although, listen, I'm not claiming to be a poor farmer, or for that matter, a poor person. We're not. We walked away from that house, and in 3 years we'll be able to buy another one, and we'll be fine because, we have earning power, right? But don't you think for a minute that this kind of stuff can't happen in the present because of, notice this, the misbehavior of the banks and Wall Street. And so I'm okay if you decide that these people are the parasites and we are the host. Okay? Thank you for paying attention. I love that you guys do that.